Welcome to 10,000 Tacos. I'm Isidro Salas, your host. Thanks again for joining us on this very latest episode of 10,000 Tacos. 10,000 Tacos is a podcast of what I constantly refer to growing up tacos. It's a collection of short stories and experiences around growing up in the taco truck. And it is also a tribute to my parents because I do believe wholeheartedly that their story needs to be told. I do believe that their sacrifice, their hard work, it needs to get thrown out there because a lot of people don't know how lucky I was to have grown up, just benefited from having this great food, and people need to know about it. So 10,000 Tacos is brought to you by, you thought I was going to get a sponsor and interrupt. No. I'm going to make a bold prediction right now. It's not even a prediction, I guess. It is more like a stance. No, it's not a stance. I am not going to advertise on this podcast. I do believe that the time that you give me is so valuable that I'm not going to give something out and say, hey, this portion of the podcast is brought to... Hey, I get it. People need to make their money. I'm going to find other ways to fund this podcast. So I'm making a declaration. I'm not going to put a sponsor on here. But anyway, let's get on with the show today. Today, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about my take on lengua. You heard what lengua is. Not many people, at least in America, are familiar with this tender type of meat, especially in a taco. Whenever I ask people, especially the people who think Taco Bell is Mexican food or real tacos, and I'll be like, yeah, tacos and lengua. What is that? What is lengua? Kidding, that they don't really say it that way. But anyway, they're not familiar with it. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about this meat. Not a lot, just a little bit. But I'm also going to tell you how this meat and the many steps to ultimately get it into the tacos that we used to sell used to drive me nuts. I used to hate this process of preparing the lengua for tacos. But I'm also going to cover how one day the task went from a dreaded one that I didn't like to a moment which got me closer to my mother. How on one ordinary day I got to see a different side of her, and how that experience later benefited my perspective about some of the benefits that came from that experience, about now that I'm getting older, how they've come to fruition, I guess. But first, we'll start out with what it really is. Lengua literally translates to tongue. It's tongue, right? The tongue. It's beef tongue. It's from the cow's mouth. Moo. That was a horrible moo. That was horrible. Let me try it again. Moo. That's a little bit better. Hope the cows don't get mad at me. So as you can imagine, it's a huge piece of meat. It weighs on average about 2.5 to 3 pounds. Now for meat, it's very heavy. It's like a tri-tip or even a brisket cut of beef. It's kind of heavy. For those of you who have ever cooked those things, it's heavy for a piece of meat. So we would buy these things by the case. That I could remember, there were about 12 to 14 of these things per case. And like most things, we'd buy them by the pound. So they'd come in a box weighing about 50 or so pounds. I used to hate taking them out of the truck, the taco truck, after my dad would do his daily route. Sometimes he would stop by and bring supplies before coming home. So When he came home with the lenguas, I used to hate taking them out of the truck because, man, these were in a big old case. And I would have to carry it into the kitchen. And at that time, I was 10, 11, 12 years old. It was pretty heavy. Today, I work out. So it's not a problem today. Just saying. I work out. Just in case you thought of it. Anyway, we would take them out of the case, the box. We'd take them out and we'd rinse them. We would have to rinse one by one. And that's one thing that my folks taught us. That was always to rinse any type of food, meat in particular, before anything else. You rinsed it out, whether it was produce, whether it was meat, whether it was something, you just rinse it out. I do it to this day. It's part of the process. And I'm glad that that's one thing that I learned. I learned a lot of things, but that stuck with me. So while this was going on, usually my mother would go out to the back of the house. We had like a storage area back there, and she would bring back this big pot, this cooking pot. This was a huge industrial cook pot. It was around 32 inches in diameter. It wasn't that tall, but by itself, it was heavy. It would take up about 2/3 of the space of the stovetop that we had at home. Remember early on, my parents used to do a lot of the cooking at home. So this pot was really big. It's the kind of pots that you see in the restaurant shows of today. These huge things you could use to, you could even use to give baby Carlos a bath if you wanted to. That's how big this thing was. Anyway, my mom would fill this thing up with water about halfway full and then fire up the burners. And as you can imagine, because it was so big and all that amount of water, it would take some time for that amount of water to get to its right cooking temperature to where it's going to start cooking. So in that time, then we were rinsing out the lenguas. So hopefully by the time we were done rinsing out the lenguas, the water would be at its cooking temperature. So once rinsed, obviously, the lenguas would be put inside of the pot and we would add more water to get it to the right amount for the long, arduous cooking process, which was about anywhere from 3 to 3.5 hours. She would then put in all her ingredients and seasonings before putting the lid on. Then lower the flame, right? Because then you got to let it, simmer it and walk away and let it do its thing. By the way, once that lid was on, you never, ever, never peeked into it until the latter part of the 3 hours. This was just a huge no-no. It's another thing I learned. Any of you who cook rice, you know how important it is to leave that lid alone. So if my friend Manuel is listening, he knows exactly what I'm talking about because one day he lifted that lid and I looked at it. Anyway, for a different episode. Thank God he doesn't really listen. So not that he doesn't listen. It's just that he doesn't listen to the podcast. Let's move on, Isidro. Let's just keep going here. Anyway, after it was determined that the cooking portion was done, my mom would wait for it cool. Not to get really cold, but for them to get at least, not to get cold, but cool enough to where you could take out the lenguas and start peeling the skin off them. This is where I would do most of my complaining. This is where I would always be like, oh, man. Because, just like I mentioned in previous episode, the picking up the tortillas with your bare hands, remember that episode? I would try to take the skin off while they were still a little hot. It was just faster when they were hot. But it was a trade-off. Yeah, there was a trade-off. If you waited for them to cool off completely, the process would take a little bit longer. So you could imagine, I chose to do this while they were hot. I learned fairly quickly to get efficient. Sometimes I'd get a slight burn, but I thought it was worth it compared to taking the skin off when they were cooled off. Because, well, it would just take longer. It's sort of like when you peel a boiled egg. If it's cold, it takes longer for those little pieces. But if it's warm, you could just flight the egg off. No? It's not making sense. Anyway, I chose the former, even if it meant getting burned. Once they were peeled and cooled, the lenguas were now ready to chop up into little cube-like pieces. I guess I was too young to do it at the time, but my other siblings, they would do most of the cubing, the chopping. They got pretty good at it. Anyway, tacos de lengua were a hit. These were not on the menu. This is kind of cool. The only customers who would order these tacos were the regular customers. We did not have to push these on people, meaning we did not have to tell people we were selling them. So for new customers who didn't know we made lengua, they missed out. They'd eventually figure it out. The funny part, I think, all they had to do was ask. It's an important lesson. All you got to do is ask sometime. Anyway, on one of these days that we were preparing the lenguas, I just was not having it. I just didn't like doing these kind of tasks. And every time something involved meat and cutting it, and I didn't like doing it. So on one of these days, it was only my mother and I. I began helping her once the lenguas were cooked and they had already completely cooled. And remember what I said about doing it faster if they were still hot? Well, by the time I started helping my mom with the lenguas, they had already cooled completely. So that meant I was in for a long day. Perhaps that's why I felt I wasn't having it on that day. I was like, ugh, man, why could my mom call me when they were still hot? Never mind, she's been in the kitchen the whole day, Isidro Salas. My thinking was I could be out playing with my friends today, but no, I have to peel the lenguas today. I know, I was such a jerk. I guess I could say that now. I was a jerk. I didn't stop being a jerk until I was like 38. That's when I matured. Just a little side note, people. At this time, I was on my third, maybe my fourth lengua, when I decided to look at one of these things in the eye, so to speak. I guess you would say, look at it in the tongue, but that doesn't sound too good. It doesn't really make sense. Anyway, I picked this thing up with both of my hands. I started looking at every angle I could, from the left to the right, top, bottom. And as I was doing this, I was tilting my head as if I was getting ready to interrogate this thing. I could only imagine I had this face, this squinting of the eyes while nodding my head back and forth slightly while holding this thing with my hands about 2 inches away from me. So it was pretty close. So then I did what came to mind at that moment. I stuck my tongue out at this thing. I was holding it and the tip of the tongue was pointing at me, and I just stuck my tongue out at it. Kind of when a kid sticks his tongue out at you and you want to smack him. Yeah, it's kind of like that. I was mad at this one. I felt as this thing had taken my day, and I was not going to let this lengua get away with it. I was like, nope, I'm holding this lengua accountable. An eye for an eye, or perhaps tongue for a tongue. Mano a mano. This was a duel. This tongue had to feel my wrath. It was quiet for what seemed to be like a few minutes. Then, from nowhere, I hear a slight chuckle. I turn to my left and I see my mom looking at me. She appears to be trying to hold off her laughter, but she can't. Then she lets it all out and begins to laugh uncontrollably. She started to laugh her butt off. Now, my mom was not a sarcastic person. My dad took care of the funny part. My mom had a solemn demeanor, very serious most times. She was always down for business first, meaning it was all about the work. The work came first. And if there was any time left over to laugh, then laughter or fun would happen. But to her, that was rare. On this day, she just let loose, man. She was laughing at me. I can only imagine her thoughts. Like, her face said, like, what the hell is wrong with this kid? Who sticks his tongue out at a bigger tongue? What the hell is he thinking? This is not my kid. And at first, I felt a little embarrassed. Then I became a bit mad because I thought she was laughing at me. But then I got it. She wasn't laughing at me. She was laughing at a kid sticking his tongue out at another tongue. I quickly got that. And then I thought it was pretty funny. Just think about it, right? So then I started to laugh. And shortly we both were laughing uncontrollably, as if we were feeding off one another. It got louder and louder, and that fed into the laughter more and more. I had not seen my mother laugh that loud. For the first time in my life, I got to see her in a lighter mood, a more pleasant mood. I can't even tell you how the rest of the lenguas were done after that, how I finished them off. I guess the laughter made it easier to peel the cold lenguas, even if it took longer. Or perhaps the laughter brings out a side of you that ignores complaining. Either way, on that day, I got to see a different side of my mom. A different way for me to do things that I didn't want to initially. Some people believe we, as human beings, become happier as we age. When I look back at that moment, I can see the truth to that. The more we laugh, the less we stress, I guess. Have you ever laughed so loud that after your stomach muscles and your cheeks hurt with joy, followed by a feeling of relaxation? It's an amazing thing. Now, whenever I order tacos de lengua, I'm reminded of that day. The day I thought talking to a lengua was going to make me feel better, or yelling at a lengua for that matter, was going to make me feel better. Only to find out that what really made me feel better was seeing my mom laugh at me. And then me joining her. That was a good day. As we close out this episode, I'd like to leave you with this talk quote. Laughter is like a taco. Life is way better with it than without it. And that is it for this episode. Thanks again for making us a part of your day. Please, if you'd be so kind to give us a review, let us know what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong. And if you can, pass this show on to others. That would be a great thing if you could do that. Help it grow organically. I hope you join us next time. Until then, I'm Isidro Salas, and this is 10,000 Tacos.